Dr. Connie Zweig, welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, I do end up talking to a lot of people kind of in the Jungian realm, people writing about, Jung's model for psychology and whatnot. Just recently, I had a really interesting conversation, I think maybe last week, about synchronicities. And so that was really cool to dive into a very specific part of, what Carl Jung talked about. And then in preparation for this, I've actually been really looking forward to talking to you about the shadow. And it's something we've mentioned on the podcast. It's something we've talked about. We've talked about shadow work, but I'm really hoping that you and I can dive really deeply into the shadow and figure out what it is and how we're supposed to work with it and all the different ways we can relate to it. But before we do that, I am curious. I do like to ask people, when it comes to psychology, symbols, archetypes, Carl Jung, this kind of realm of life. I'm curious, when did you first get connected with this, or what drew you into it?
Um, I started meditation when I was very young. I was 19 and it was for no holy reason. It was because I wanted to date a guy who would not go out with me unless I started Transcendental Meditation. So I began doing TM at 19 and found it to be deeply relaxing and enjoyable and ended up becoming a TM teacher. And so my 20s were spent in the TM movement, teaching meditation and exploring and learning about it. And slowly, what started to happen was that the organization became more and more dogmatic and more rigid. People began to lie about their experiences in order to get new practices. There was a kind of a group think starting to happen, people starting to look alike and talk alike. And I got freaked out and I left. And it was a very heartbreaking disillusionment for me to face that kind of hypocrisy in the most sacred arena of my life. And so I began to explore how I got there. What was the longing? I call it holy longing. What was my holy longing about for transcendence, for awakening? In those days, we called it enlightenment. Now everybody calls it non-duality. What was that holy longing about? And to explore the psychology of it and what the various schools of psychology taught about that spiritual yearning or religious longing for the divine. There are so many different ways to language it. And so I ended up going to graduate school at Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is the last DepthPsychology school in the country, to study Carl Jung, and got my doctorate. And during this time, I was working in the publishing world, and I started publishing books about depth psychology and meeting all kinds of people. The first one I did myself was called Meeting the Shadow, which was an anthology of 65 kind of expert thinkers on the shadow in every arena of life, in the family, in couples, in the body and health, in politics, in creativity, every arena. And it kind of struck a chord, and I realized that people were looking for this understanding as I was. Um, and so when I finished grad school and had my doctorate, I went into clinical practice. And then I authored a book called Romancing the Shadow, in which a colleague and I developed a method to begin to kind of catch a glimpse of our shadow and work with it to make it more conscious, because the shadow, by definition, is unconscious outside of awareness. So, Romancing the Shadow was my first authored book. And it sort of emerged out of this ongoing interest that I had about myself, what motivated me, and then at the same time, my clients, because the books kind of became the referral system for my clinical practice. And all these people were coming to explore their shadows. And so we launched this method of shadow work. And this was in the 1990s. So this is a long time career interest for me. It hasn't kind of been flash in the pan. And then eventually, um, in my late 60s, I saw that there was nothing really written about depth psychology and aging. And so, after several years of interviews and research, I wrote The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, and just extended my method of shadow work into late life for people in midlife and beyond. And then I came back to what had been my dissertation. It became an earlier book. I came back to it, the subject of spirituality and shadow, and that holy longing and what that was about. And published a book called Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, which really explored, why we long for charismatic teachers, what that's all about, why so much of that process becomes abusive and disillusioning, how the shadows engaged in that arena. And so there are 4 books in the series now, in my career in shadow work.
Yeah, awesome. It sounds like this wasn't a flash in the pan. You really
Yeah.
put a lot of time and effort into this. That's awesome. I'm actually curious about, you mentioned transcendental meditation, and I'm not super familiar with it. I've always just known of it as like a process of meditating. But the way
Mhm.
you talk about it is that it's an actual formalized group and that there was a dogma forming. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, TM is a method. It's a mantra meditation that was brought from India by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. It was kind of made popular by the Beatles in the late 60s and early 70s. And there were millions of people doing TM. And he kind of sold it as a stress reduction technique. And that's what enabled people to kind of accept it, that it wasn't Hinduism and they could still be Christian or Jewish or whatever, or agnostic. Um, and so it became a very popular meditation method. It's less so now as Buddhist practices have, really become much more popular. Um, and for me, I moved on from that in 1979. Um, but I think that the description of the organization as starting out very open and flexible and exciting, um, and then becoming more regimented, more authoritarian, more controlling. That happens with many, many organizations. I mean, this is kind of the lifespan of group dynamics. And I'm not saying that every group becomes abusive, but I'm saying that when there's a charismatic leader and people are projecting on him or her a lot of their unmet childhood needs, they become very obedient, they can become true believers, and then the whole thing becomes kind of cult-like, you know. And from my point of view, that's what happened with TM. Not everybody agrees with that, but from my point of view, there was some lying on the part of the teacher. So there were these shadow issues that kept coming to light and that just disturbed me too much to continue to participate.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me because I can see it as well. Anytime that there's a group of people coming together to try to figure out something spiritually or to work through something spiritually, you always run the risk of what you call a charismatic leader or anybody in the group actually taking advantage of the situation and in group dynamics, you see that all the time, where just slowly things kind of form into some kind of concrete understanding that everybody's supposed to agree upon. The irony being that in any form of meditation, you're trying to kind of let go of things and like not hold on to, I don't know, such rigid understandings or such rigid stories about the situation. But it is a, yeah, it's an interesting jump as well, because you started to see things that were going on there, and now you speak about them as aspects of the shadow, maybe the group shadow, individual shadow, that kind of blend together. Did you have that language back then, or did that come later after you?
No, I didn't have that language in my 20s. What I had was a gut awareness that there were, red flags. And I would talk to people, and most people were in denial. They didn't want to look at it. And eventually it just became intolerable for me. And I lost all my friends, and I lost my purpose, and I lost my community. But for me, that's what had to happen. And life unfolded, in a very beautiful way. So, I mean, there's no doubt or regret about that choice. But other people chose to stay. And I think, my book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, has a lot of interviews with people who have gone through this in all different denominations. You can go through this in a church or a synagogue community. You can go through it in a political tribe, with a charismatic leader and peer pressure to conform. You can go through it in all different kinds of communities, but in a spiritual community where your heart is so open and your hopes, are so fragile, it can be devastating. And so one of the things I try to do is teach shadow awareness. So maybe we should stop and define the shadow
Yeah, that would be great.
for people who aren't aware of what I'm talking about. So Carl Jung coined this term, personal shadow, to refer to this part of us that's outside of our awareness and yet is having this controlling influence on our thoughts and behaviors, often self-sabotaging our conscious intentions. So when we're children, all of us, we're like little sponges. And we're shaped by the messages we're getting from the adults around us, parents and grandparents, teachers and clergy persons, right? And they're all giving us messages about what's good and what's bad, what will give us love and approval, and what will lead to punishment or shame or criticism, right? And this is not a conscious process at 2 years old or 5 years old, right? This is just, we're the little sponge and we're learning in this soup of reactions from the adults. And we learn that, if we're told to go into our room and close the door, so we did something bad. We can learn a more subtle level just from a glance or a gesture that's shaming from someone. Or when we're in school, we can learn from a peer, who ignores us, doesn't want to be our friend anymore. And so we're constantly learning, and what is deemed good or positive or approved goes into the ego, the conscious personality, and we become a nice boy or a nice girl, right? Polite, gentle, good student, obedient. And what is deemed negative to the ego goes into the shadow. So in some families, that might be anger. It might be sadness. My dad didn't want to see me unhappy. He felt like a failure. I hid that. Other people, they are really channeled to be academic performers. But what if they have an artistic gift or an athletic gift that's not valued, goes into the shadow? So you see, it isn't only quote, negative traits and behaviors. It's only negative to the ego. And so if your conscious personality says learning to play music is a waste of time, I have to really, thrive in school to become a lawyer like my father, then that talent is going to go into the shadow too. So anything at all can become shadow content. And the shadow is in the whole body mind. It's not like a little corner in the head, right? We know that the body mind is all functionally identical, interacting, chemicals going back and forth. So this material is everywhere in us. And if you know what I mean by the subtle body, the energy bodies, it's in our chakras. There's shadow material in every chakra. So what happens as we age, then we become adolescents and we start to rebel. What is that about? Some part is erupting that can no longer kind of obey the rules. And we can say that some shadow material is emerging, or a midlife crisis. People are going along and they're living a conventional life, and suddenly they blow it all up. They want a divorce, they want to change jobs, they want to sell the house. What is that? Jung called it the unlived life in the shadow, erupts. Or someone generally behaves and then suddenly steals something, or tells a lie, or starts drinking too much, or smoking too much weed. What is that? So we can look at all of these behaviors in the context of unconscious material erupting into behavior and sabotaging us.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced most of those that you've listed off. And I think it's good that, like, I appreciate you pointing out that the shadow is not just negative content. It's negative to the ego, but it's not negative to the overall psyche or even to our lives. Because, I guess in all Jungian, I don't know, Jungian thoughts or metaphors or models, there seems to be a light side and a dark side to everything, including the shadow. The shadow has all of these things that could be good for us, that we're hiding from ourselves or that our ego is hiding from us. And then it also has all these things that we're unaware of that are holding us back, that are actually being detrimental to our conscious goals, to the things that we want to accomplish. Can you speak a little bit to the ego as far as is it a strong ego that holds back all this shadow, or do you see it more as a weak ego, or do you have another way of looking at an ego that is holding back as much as it can in the shadow?
Well, the ego is just a construct. I mean, you get to a stage of meditation where you see through the ego and you recognize it's just a mechanism. But in psychology, it's kind of real. In that framework, it's looked at as the small self, the way in which we define ourselves, not the big self, like in spiritual language, right? So, in answer to your question, if there isn't enough ego development, people can become psychotic because there's so much unconscious material flooding the psyche. So when that happens, when the psyche is flooded and the ego can't contain it, then people really struggle with mental illness. So there is this dynamic between ego and shadow that goes on throughout our lives. And my method works like this. You learn a centering practice, first of all, some kind of meditation or grounding practice, belly breath or vipassana, walking meditation, something that grounds you in your body and quiets your mind. And then you begin to do self-observation. You watch when the shadow emerges. It could be a thought that you want to disown. It could be a feeling that's really uncomfortable or shameful, right? It could be a physical sensation that's unfamiliar to you. And you begin to tune in and you notice that that repeats every day, every week, whatever it is. And you begin to notice the consequences of that. So, someone says to herself, I'm lonely. If I eat just a little more ice cream, maybe he'll call me. I'll just wait for him to call, right? And she notices that every night she's saying the same thing to herself. And the same feelings of loneliness and disappointment go with that thought, maybe abandonment. And the same physical sensations go with it. Maybe her throat is closed and her belly is tight. So now she has 3 cues that a figure from the shadow, I call it a shadow character, is emerging. And every time that same shadow character is leading her to eat the ice cream, it has the same thoughts, feelings, and sensations. I was blown away when I discovered this. So now what does she do? She gives it a name, the foodie. And she gives it an image, a big open mouth. Now she has something she can work with. She's personified this character that was unconscious before, outside of her influence. And now, whenever she hears or feels or senses the foodie, she has an instant in which to choose, do I want to eat that or not? The foodie is here. Now I have a moment of choice. And that compulsion is broken, or we could say that unconscious identification with that shadow is broken because she's conscious of it now. She has a little bit of space from it in her awareness. And then she can break the pattern by making different choices. And, each of these shadow characters, and we all have many of them, has a valid need. So let's say for this woman with the foodie, what is the need of that shadow that's driving her to the ice cream? It's to speak up to her boyfriend and ask him if he's interested or not, right? She's stuffing her voice and her feelings and her needs. And she learned that because probably her mother did the same thing with the father. Because we trace back the origins of the foodie in the family and we see that. So there's this valid need inside of every shadow character, even the destructive ones. And that's another insight that Jung had about the gold in the shadow. Because if we can begin to meet that need consciously, we won't have to meet it unconsciously through acting out. So in this case, my client eventually, over months, called the boyfriend. And he said, no, I'm not in the relationship. I couldn't tell you, but I don't want it. So she was devastated, right? For a while. And a few weeks went by and she was mourning it and slowly letting go. And eventually she said, oh my God, I might never have known. And she could stop eating the ice cream compulsively because she wasn't stuffing those feelings anymore. So this has a lot of effect, downstream as you do the work. And this is the emphasis in Romancing the Shadow. It's about shadow work in relationships and how these shadow characters come up again and again, like the critic. Everybody has the same repeating fight, right? Or the liar, or the cheater, whatever the shadow character is, and you begin to make a conscious relationship with it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I've never heard such a concise method for approaching the shadow, but just to kind of go back, it starts with a meditative or grounding practice where you're just paying attention to what you're experiencing. And then you're basically pairing thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And so you're kind of noticing this pattern of oh, I have this thought or this desire or this impulse, and then, well, how do I feel when that comes up, and what emotions come with it, but also what physical sensations come with it. And then I think it's the just how simple it is to label things. I never really, like, I don't think I followed this process exactly, but there have been times in my life where I've had to actually look at something that I'm experiencing on the inside, some kind of internal experience, and just put a label on it. And once you put a label on it, it just makes it this thing that's tangible in a way where you can actually work with it. It has a name, it has being. And then also the way you describe visualizing it or turning it into something, some kind of object that you can picture in your head. It's so powerful because then it really does become something, like you said, there's some distance there, but it's like it's become something that's not entirely intertwined with you. It's a little bit separate from you. And
Exactly.
yeah, and so then you can actually interact with it rather than feeling that it is you. I mean, this is something I think about all the time, but when we have emotions or we have impulses, when we do these, we act out in whatever way, a lot of the times we describe them as though we are the thing. So instead of saying I'm feeling angry, we'll say I am angry,
Right.
but you're not actually angry, you're experiencing that. So but if you don't ever become aware of that, it's just so easy for those things to overtake you, and your behavior becomes this thing that it can distance you from yourself. It can put a rift between you and the people in your life who you have relationships with. But simply going through that process and identifying it, I think that's very powerful. It also reminds me of internal family systems, and I'm curious how familiar you are with internal family systems, or IFL.
IFS. Just
Oh,
a
sorry,
little bit.
IFS. Yeah.
I have a colleague who's very engaged with it, so we talk just a little bit. There are some differences and some similarities in our methods. You're making a really good point, which is that as long as this character is undifferentiated inside of me, it's coloring my psyche. The moment that I'm craving the ice cream, I'm lost in it. So the idea is to break that identification with it and make it into an object. It goes from subject to object. And sometimes I have people dialogue with it. Okay, so now you recognize it's the foodie. Foodie, I feel you. I see you. I know you're here now. What do you need? What are you looking for? I am not you. You're a shadow character. I am not the foodie. You're a shadow character. But let's talk about what you need in this moment, or write about it, or draw the shadow character at that moment, because that gets it outside of your psyche onto the page, just what you're talking about. And that's when we can begin to get some influence, some self-control, some more mastery over our own behavior.
Yeah, and then also, I guess on the flip side, there's going to be examples of shadow characters or aspects of you that actually aren't trying to push you towards some kind of acting out in a negative way, but for it's going to be something positive. So for a lot of people who I know, they have these ideas of like, oh, I want to be creative in this way, I want to do this, I want to try to start a business, I want to try to write a book, I want to be a painter.
Yes.
And these thoughts sit with them forever and ever, and in the same way I think that emotions probably arise and sensations arise with those thoughts, but in the same way they're not able to fully act on them. Would the approach be the same then? Would you go through the same
So
process?
I posted a free video webinar on my website about creativity and shadow work because this is so crucial for so many people. It's conniezweig.com for anyone who's interested. There's a free video, and it goes through how the shadow can sabotage each step of the creative process. So initially, when you're just dreaming about it, or once you've started it, once you're in the middle of it, and whether it's, the procrastinator or the perfectionist or the fear of failure or whatever it is, at each stage of creativity, there can be a shadow character And when you think about all of the people through history who've had all these innovative ideas and dreams and been blocked. I mean, with writing, we call it writer's block. But how many people have been sabotaged by their shadows because they didn't have tools to complete, you know, their thinking process, their productivity, their whatever their end point was. So yes, very important, and the same method can apply.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And I've heard a lot of people talk about that creative process where those blocks come up. I've heard a lot of people talk about it as though that's your ego, because a lot of times it almost seems like the story comes from your ego, like, oh, you're gonna fail, or people won't appreciate it, or it won't be as good. And so I guess you already pointed out that the ego is just a construct in the same way that I think maybe it's just easy or it's helpful to think about things in this way, where even if you're just giving it the label of the ego, but I guess with your process, you might label those very specific things, like that's the person who's afraid to fail, or the person who's afraid to be embarrassed, or something like that.
Yeah, when it's when it's conscious and we understand its roots, where it comes from, then it may be from the ego. If it's mostly rooted in the unconscious, but it just shows up as inner dialogue, I'm afraid to fail, and you don't know where that comes from or why you feel that way, then it's a shadow character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I would almost imagine for a lot of people, it doesn't even come out as a full sentence like that. I'm afraid to fail. It's probably more of just like a feeling of, fear, or maybe even just like it comes out as a procrastination, like, oh, just put it off.
Yeah,
I'll do it here. I'll do it then. But did you just keep pushing it down the road? And so it may
that's
not
right.
even fully form as a thought.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why, these three dimensions of inner dialogue and feelings and bodily sensation, many people can access the shadow character through one of those and not another one. So if you're real body centered or kinesthetic, it's easier for you to get it that way. Oh, I'm nauseous and queasy again. My shoulders are tight. And that's fine. That cue is telling you enough for that if that shadow character is repeatedly having that cue, right? Other people like me, more auditory, listening to the inner dialogue is the easier way in. So all of those are fine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That even, pairs with Jung's idea of the introvert, extrovert, the thinker versus the feeler. And you're going to have to,
Typology.
yeah, you're going to have to figure out which type you are, which type you lean towards, and then learn how to work with that. That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious now to this idea of romancing the shadow. And so when I think about romancing the shadow, my thought or my mind immediately goes to our modern myth of romance and this idea that you're going to find somebody out there that's going to complete you, when in reality you it probably should turn that inward and find those parts inside of yourself. But I'm curious what you mean when you say romancing the shadow. What is romancing, and
Well,
how do we go about doing that?
yeah, we just use that term to mean creating a conscious relationship with it. So it's a kind of a dance because the shadow is slippery. Its nature is to hide, to go behind the threshold of awareness, behind the curtain. And then it'll pop out again in some crazy way, maybe in a mean comment or in a projection onto someone you don't know, or in a dream where you're doing something you would never do, right? Or in a critical comment to someone you care about. And then it recedes again. You can't hold on to it. You can't um, keep it in your awareness. Its nature is slippery. And so with this method, you coax it out and you begin to get to know it, and then it recedes again. And that's the process of remembering and forgetting. Say with the foodie, Oh, there's the ice cream, remembering, and then forgetting, stuffing the feelings back down again, and remembering, and until you seduce it into awareness often enough that you really have a conscious relationship with it. And then what happens is it loses its grip because it holds a lot of charge in the unconscious. It could be unconscious for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's building charge. And as you begin to bring it out more and more and more, it loses that charge and it changes inside of you.
Yeah, the way that I would describe my own experience with this is in writing, where yeah, I sit down and I try really hard not to think ahead of time exactly the words I'm going to use. I just want to sit down and kind of let it flow out of me in an unconscious way, to the point where like what I see on the page surprises me. And when I go through, I go and I write a bunch of stuff, and then I go through and I edit it and I edit it and I get to know it better and better and better. The fascinating thing about it is I'll go into a writing project with certain complexes or emotional issues or lack of an awareness about some part of myself, and I can feel it in my body in a way. Like, I would say before I started writing, I always carried this kind of heavy pit in my stomach. And what I learned through writing and through other things as well, but what I learned is that that I was just ignoring so many parts of myself, that this pit would sit there, and it was like this signal that all these other things were going on, but I wasn't paying attention to them. And just by spending time writing and letting certain characters come out, certain situations, certain memories, and then going over and over it in the editing process, by the time I got done with it, I had this experience of realizing that I no longer have this pit in my stomach. I feel like the creative process, I guess, in a way, for me, helped me build that relationship with parts of myself I was unaware of, parts of myself that were in the shadow, in such a way that I was just flabbergasted by how different life felt. Like, I felt like a different person after that.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Is
beautiful. I
yeah,
know what you mean about, because if I look at my writing history, since I've been writing for 50 years, there was a time, early on, I was writing from my mind, right? And I was thinking and stressing and focusing, and then I'd be tired. And at a certain point, what I discovered was I would do all my research and then I would go meditate or sometimes go sleep. And then I would come to the keyboard and it would come through. And I wasn't writing from my mind anymore. It was a completely different experience of flow, and I would be energized afterwards instead of tired. So there are these different kind of modes of creativity and ways of working with the blocks and working with the body. And, people can find what works for them. I know for some people, they go for a walk before they write. Some people eat, some people don't eat, you know. Some people connect with a loved one, some people want to be isolated. Music, no music. So, it's creativity is it's archetypal. It has some general rules that apply to everyone, but it's also has these individual needs built into it.
yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, and you're interested in archetypes and myths. So most of these shadows have an archetypal component, and some of them have a mythic component that goes with that archetype. So in Romancing the Shadow, I wrote about my own journey of living the life of Athena, the Greek goddess who was, she's one of the virgin goddesses who didn't want to bond with a man and who was self-sufficient. She's the goddess of the city. She had a lot of authority. And every single aspect of her myth was true in my life. It blew my mind. She was born from her father's head, which is my story. Um, Men in her life are friends, which was my story at the time. She's like the ally of the hero. And then I met Neil, my husband. And in order to shift from the myth of Athena, living that myth, to becoming a wife, took years for me, years of shadow work, because that goddess had been giving me this rich, fulfilling career life, but no intimacy with men. And so she became a shadow character. She became the saboteur. And every time I would sort of sabotage the connection with Neil, he'd go, "That's Athena." And I would have to do my shadow work, right? And so I think for a lot of us, if you can find the myth you're living, you can find the shadow aspect of it. You can find, like you said, the light side, what it's generating, what it's creating, and the dark side of it, what it's how it's limiting you, how it's sabotaging you. You know, so the kind of qualities that Athena had that I wanted to maintain, and the ones that I wanted to release as I became more and more intimate with a partner and eventually got married. I couldn't get married living the myth of Athena. It would not have happened.
So,
So yeah,
well, yeah, just in that, and you said find the discovering or finding the myth that you're living. Did that happen naturally for you? Did you just come across the Athena myth and realize, oh, this is what I'm doing? Or did you go looking for it?
it happened in graduate school. We were studying mythology. Yeah. And it just totally blew my mind. And you know, part of what happens when you discover that there's this archetypal level, like the hero's journey, you discover the hero's journey and you see that there are these archetypal moments in everyone's life. I wrote about my life story as the hero's journey in the inner work of age because I was doing, in my late 60s, I was doing a life review. And I saw, oh my God, all these moments were in Joseph Campbell's myth. It was mind-blowing. So I've had those two experiences of sort of seeing my personal life mirrored by something larger and recognizing that we're connected to something much larger and universal that's typically invisible to most people. And it's very uplifting, inspiring to discover that.
Yeah, and I guess I would imagine it also helps you kind of see the path forward at times. When you decided, oh, I've got this intimate side of myself that's in my shadow. I haven't been fostering it. But now that I'm moving into this relationship and I'm trying to make this work, was there another myth that you found or another archetype that you found? Or was it strictly just going through the same shadow work process of labeling that part of yourself and trying to, coax it out with gentleness and trying to
Well,
understand
I
it?
didn't want to contrive to replace Athena with something from my head, right? So I did the shadow work and just allowed it to unfold. And what I found is there is no Greek archetype for me as a contemporary woman who's independent and in a marriage. There's no Greek archetype for that.
Yeah, because you're looking
Um,
for both sides, both the Athena side, but also the committed,
yeah,
intimate side. Yeah.
but there are in other cultures. And in Hinduism, there's a goddess named Saraswati, and she's the goddess of learning and music and so many things that I'm passionate about. And so, in some ways, um, they're all in us. They're latent. All these archetypal figures, they're latent in us. And sometimes when you romance the shadow, you can catch a glimpse of the archetype that you're missing, that you're failing to see, like just like what happened to me. So it's not so much about, I mean, people can do it through reading. I'm not discouraging that, you can read the goddesses in every woman or something. But I'm saying it's more, for me, it was more of an intuitive process of living my life and what shows up and how do I respond to it and how does it fit, you know? I don't think there are any sort of ancient myths about marriage that fit my marriage with Neil. It didn't exist hundreds or thousands of years ago, right? So, in some ways, and that's a question, are we creating new archetypes? I mean, Jung would say no, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I almost see, like you were saying, that these archetypes, they're all inside of us, and they might be, what was the word used? Latent or
Yeah, latent.
latent. They're latent inside of you, but they're all in there. And, but at the same time, I see us as these biological creatures that have changed over time. And I almost see this version of, I see story as, and everything that encompasses, the narrative arc and archetypes and the hero's journey, all these different ways of describing story and what's in story. I see that as just the evolution of how our consciousness came to be. If you
Yeah.
really think about the mind, it has to have a way of conceptualizing the world around it in some way. It has to be able to conceptualize relationships and interactions and whatever it may be. And it just seems that this is how our minds did it, is they evolved this method of storytelling. And so if that's the case, if it is an evolution and if we are moving forward, it very may well be that new stories could emerge, that new archetypes could emerge. But I'm just theorizing, or I'm just speculating. I don't have very
Well,
solid like reasons to
yeah.
or
I mean,
examples.
in my lifetime, there have been so many sort of collective, so many movements to create a new story, to tell a new narrative. So many about women, about gay rights, about civil rights, about um, um, just about anything, climate.
Yeah,
Like,
climate.
look at for decades the story we've been trying to tell about climate, right?
Yeah, you see a lot of things
And
about nationality, patriotism,
yeah.
colonialism. It's all new kind of stories trying to bubble up.
So, one thing before we go that I feel is important is the story of democracy today. And the story that we've told ourselves about this country for 200 years, and the story that we're telling now, that's unfolding now, that some people are telling and other people are not telling. And I want to say this because shadow work is connected to this. So, one of the ways we meet the shadow is in our projections, in our immediate, exaggerated, unconscious responses to other people. When we attribute something in our shadows to somebody else so that they can carry it for us, right? So we might go to a party and say, oh God, she's so seductive, and we don't know anything about her. Or he's so aggressive, and he's a stranger, right? And so it's like we're carrying an arrow and shooting it out every once in a while. And sometimes we do that and we fall in love. We project the positive traits, or we find a spiritual teacher. He's so wise and enlightened, and he carries that projection. So part of what's happened now with Trump is he has weaponized shadow projection on a mass scale. He's now institutionalized it into the government. And what's really important for me is to just remind people they don't have to participate in that. They can do their own shadow work as a social responsibility. and not contribute their own darkness to the political process that's going on right now. The minute you start to demonize someone, the minute you feel hatred and self-righteousness, the minute you create an other, whether it's an individual or a tribe, because a lot of what's happening is very tribal. It's humanity's tribal stage is what we see now. Not rational, not post-conventional, not, spiritually aware, tribal. And as long as we're participating in projecting the otherness, then we're contributing to this darkness. And so I really see shadow work as a social and political responsibility today. And not as some isolated, because you and I are talking about, highfalutin archetypes and all this, right? It's here. The shadow is screaming from the headlines every single day now. And it's very important that we all get our hearts and our conscience in the right place.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. The way that I've thought about psychology for a long time is that anything that's happening on the individual level, whether we talk about the unconscious or the shadow, the different archetypes, those same dynamics play out in the group as a collective unconscious. And in that way, we all add to it and we all take from it. And I agree with you completely that the best thing that any of us can do is to stop shouting, stop following the crowd, to stop projecting, and stop with the activism, stop with the violence, and just look inward. And the more that each of us works on our own individual shadows and does our own shadow work, as you've described in our conversation, that is the only path forward for actually creating the environment or the society that many of us kind of dream of or wish that we could be a part of.
Yeah, I don't want to split inner work and outer work. I'm not saying activism is bad. I think for some people, it's a powerful path, and some people need to express their voices that way. Today, all the people fighting for climate at the UN, I'm not discouraging that, but we need to do activism with shadow awareness, not out of hatred and self-righteousness, out of compassion, out of understanding, out of inclusion, right? Out of our interconnectedness with all living things. And that's very different from reactive activism. So for me, they need to go together. And, I'm at the stage of life where I'm not in the streets anymore, but I used to be. And Jane Fonda is out there, in her 90s, and Bill McKibben. And I'm all for them. But what I'm saying is, I'm saying it's not either or, Josh. I'm saying bring our self-awareness and our shadow awareness with us into the public forum, into our relationships, into our families, into the workplace, into our writing, wherever we are. That's how we show up.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. Because at some level, whether we think about it biologically, politically, psychologically, as humans, we are part of a group, right? And the more that we can be aware and bring that awareness to the group. But it is tricky. It's like a scary thing. So very early on in this conversation, you were talking about leaving a group because it was starting to become too dogmatic. And then when you were talking about when we were first introducing the idea of shadow, you were saying that it can be applied to a lot of different things, politics, it can be in the workforce. And for me, one of the places I've experienced a lot is in family. And I guess my thought is just if you're going to do real shadow work and you're going to bring that to the group, it's not going to be easy because a lot of the times the group will reject you for that. So I think it takes like a lot of real effort and genuine kind of honest work, but it's going to require some, in the same way that you had to leave your group because of it. Um, when you bring
It
that,
requires skill.
yeah,
And the most important skill I could recommend, especially in families, is using I statements. I feel upset. I feel uncomfortable. I feel unseen. I feel unappreciated. That's bringing the shadow into the family, but it's being accountable. Once you say you didn't do that, or you did it this way, then the person's going to get defensive and that's going to be conflict. So that's a really small but important practice for people to use, is just being accountable for your experience and teaching kids how to communicate that way. Teaching kids to use I statements can change their lives. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's great advice. We've only got a couple more minutes left, but one of the other things, and you've touched on it a little bit related to shadow and the shadow work, is in aging, because you did write this book. Um, I have it here.
The inner
The
work of
inner work of
age.
age, yeah, shifting from role to soul. So do you mind just speaking a little bit about how this work, this shadow work, and this process, how it can be applied, as you know, for those who are getting up into older age?
Well, life changes with midlife in our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? I know people who are in their 90s now who are living a great life. So, with the new longevity, we have a lot of years post retirement. And especially if we have our health, we have a lot of years to practice inner work and continue to develop and continue to contribute. The trick is, so the way that the inner work of age is written, it's kind of a rite of passage for growing old because we don't have that in our culture. And the first step is to recognize your internalized ageism against yourself. So that shadow character is the inner ageist. And it was shocking to me when I interviewed people, how many people talked about how they hated their bodies and how they looked, and problems with their mind, problems with their health, problems with dependency, on and on and on, problems with caregiving. And they had internalized these negative messages about aging and maybe even projected that onto older people when they were young, right? Because I remember my father doing that. And then now we're projecting it onto themselves. So that's the first shadow character that I introduced. And then there's a whole bunch more. One of them is the doer, which is the part of us that's identified with doing and achievement and productivity and success. And there's a stage in everyone's life where that begins to slow down. It may be with official retirement, and it may not. It may not be an external event that happens. But the precious gift in that, the potential in that, is to begin to shift our identity from the doer. Remember, we were talking about how we get identified with these characters. To begin to shift our identity with the doer, which is probably a lifelong identity, to something deeper, to our spiritual nature. Some people call that soul, some call it Christ nature or Buddha nature or spirit or essence, or emptiness. Whatever language you use, it's about releasing the doer, getting free of that identity, and deepening into who you really are. It's not a role. It's not the CEO or the school teacher or the mom, not really who you are, or the writer or the therapist. It's not really who you are. It's a role. So the question, who am I, returns. That spiritual question returns if people do this work. And the book is full of practices. Every chapter ends with shadow work practices and spiritual practices to work with a character and to deepen your identity into who you really are. And there's also a chapter on activism, doing inner work and doing activism in that particular book. So it's had a wonderful response, this book. There are hundreds and hundreds of, I call them wisdom circles around the world, of groups of people reading together and doing the practices together, because there was nothing out there. I mean, I was looking for something. I wrote it because I needed it. I was looking for something to make this transition for myself, and there was nothing out there. So it's been very rewarding, this particular book, and meaningful for me. The interviews and the reader responses have been very rewarding.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with me as well, or just have this conversation with me and discuss these ideas. Um, yeah, it seems like, you've been an explorer your whole life, and so just the fact that you needed something and you went out and found it so that you could share it with others. I mean, that's that's taking the hero's journey. So I really appreciate it. I
That's
appreciate you
true.
taking the time with me. Um, yeah, thank you so much, Connie. If people wanted to find your work, if they wanted to find your writing, your books, you mentioned a creativity kind of webinar. Where would people go find these things?
So there are lots of free videos on conniezweig.com. I have a couple of webinars coming up before the end of the year. Those are listed there. I have a Substack, which is a live stream with another woman who writes about the shadow. And the Substack is called Shadow Work Awareness. For people who are interested in consciousness and spiritual development, I have a podcast with my husband called Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality. And that's on all the podcast platforms. You can find that. And we're in conversation about his spiritual experiences, which have been astounding. So that's where they can find me. And I'm practicing the shift from role to soul, so I don't know that I'll be doing this for that much longer.